Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this early Sunday afternoon in New York City. I'm Ariola Pira, curator at the Verilist Center for Art and Politics. My pronouns are she, her, and I have brown, short hair, fair skin, and I'm wearing a black top. On behalf of the Verilist Center team and board and our colleagues and friends at the New School, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's programs, The Idols of ISIS, co-presented with Cabinet Magazine. My co-host is Sina Najafi, founder and editor-in-chief of Cabinet Magazine, and a friend of the Verilist Center, having previously been a member of the Verilist Center Advisory Committee. Sina and many of our speakers today join us from Berlin, but I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that I, a white immigrant and speaking from Brooklyn, New York, the land of the Lenape, among other indigenous people. This is important to acknowledge because we'll be speaking a lot today about violent removal and destruction of cultural heritage and the role museums and idols play in the expansion and power hold of Western imperialism, which is paralleled, if not surpassed, by the violence and ongoing legacy of settler colonialism and genocide of indigenous people in this country. With that, I invite you to consider not only the history of this violent expropriation of property and life and cultural cleansing here and elsewhere, but to actively join in and support indigenous demands and organizing for sovereignty, repatriation, and abolition. We'll also be speaking a lot about art and politics and whether the latter can exist without images. This is our métier here at the Verilist Center, a scholarly research platform and public forum at the New School, dedicated exclusively to the intersection of art and politics. We champion and nurture vibrant communities and networks of people committed to developing new political imaginaries. Today's program is an excellent example of the type of cross-disciplinary, artistic and research-driven programming that we support. Our current focus theme is Ask for Protocols, which over the next 2 years, we will search, create, and work called for, dismantle protocols that will empower us politically, help us come together as communities and allies. We understand protocols as evidence of control or expressive power to structure and set the tone and conditions that regulate the flow of people, resources, ideas, including images, else we'll hear shortly. But before I turn it over to Sina, who will introduce Aaron Tugendhaft in his book, and the speakers who join him today to discuss image breaking and making, a final note on protocols. The chat is enabled and we encourage you to ask questions and engage in the conversation there. We will be mining the chat throughout this event and leading up to the Q&A portion of our program. Please follow instructions in the chat on how to access the ASL interpreter window and live closed captioning via web captioner. With that, I turn it over to Sina, who will welcome our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariola. Thank you all for joining us. I see some people from Vancouver even, 9 a.m. there. 3 of the presenters are in Berlin, 6 p.m. So all the different time zones. Thank you for coming. We are here today to discuss this amazing book that Aaron just published with the University of Chicago Press. And I want to thank all the speakers for the panelists for joining us. The order in which they will go will be Aaron Tugendhaft first, followed by Wendy Shaw, who's a professor here in Berlin, Regine Sahakian, who's in California and is a writer, and Michael Rakowitz in Chicago, an artist. I also want to thank the Verilist Center for jumping in so enthusiastically when we approached them about doing this project with us. Don't want to take up any much more time, so we'll just jump right in with Aaron, who's going to give us about 5-7 minutes of remarks on his book, and then the 3 presenters. Aaron.
Thanks, Sina. Thanks, Ariola. It's a real pleasure to, I guess, be here in my apartment in Berlin, but talking to all of you. So on February 26, 2015, I was at a lecture at ISAW, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU in New York. And it was a lecture by the Columbia art historian of ancient Near Eastern art, Zainab Bahrani, and she was giving a lecture on art and modernism. Actually, some of my former students from Munich were visiting at the time, and I'd been spending the whole day with them, and we sort of went to ISAW as the capstone of their visit to New York. And during the question and answer period after Zainab's talk, somebody in the audience asked in a very distressed way, sort of, what did she think should be done about what had happened that day? And I didn't know what he was referring to. I had been with my students all day and I just didn't know. And so I went off into the corner as one, and I did what most people do in order to get news. I checked my phone to look at Facebook, and I found posted on my Facebook feed, numerous times, a video of an ISIS video of people smashing sculpture in the museum in Mosul. And I think a lot of people saw this video, but I think maybe particularly because of me, because of the fact that I have background in ancient Near Eastern studies, the algorithm gave me many iterations of this video. And when I saw it, I immediately connected it to another image. And so I'm just going to share something here for you, right? And so the top image here is a still from the Islamic State video from the Mosul Museum. The bottom image is 2,500 years older than the video still, but from a location about 25 kilometers from Mosul, so very, very nearby to Mosul. And it is, this is actually a 19th century drawing of a now lost relief from the Palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad, which is from the 8th century BC. And as you, I think, can see, both images show three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king, both even with this kind of conical hat showing, depicting the statue as the statue of a king lying here horizontally on the ground. And so when I saw the video and I thought of this ancient Assyrian image, which I knew, and I knew it actually because I had used it I'd chosen it as the cover for a previous book of mine, an anthology of essays that I co-edited called Idle Anxiety. And I had chosen the image for the cover, but actually nowhere in the book do I discuss the image, and I'd never really thought about the image. And I now thought, well, this is an opportunity to really think about what was going on in this Assyrian image and what's going on in this ISIS image, and why this uncanny resemblance between the two. And so I started thinking about it, and I realized that this is really an opportunity to write something where my background really converged. So as some of you might know, I had spent a lot of time studying a vast range of subjects. I had been trained originally in art history, and then in the history of religions, and then in Assyriology, and sort of always along the line in political theory. I had written on idolatry before. This is what the ISIS members were claiming they were destroying. They were destroying idols. And so somehow all of that training suddenly converged on this pair. And I thought I would think about it some more, and what emerged was this book that Sina already showed you. Here, I'm going to stop sharing the image. Let's see if I can. Actually, Ariola, can you stop sharing it for me? I can't seem to do it.
Give me 1 second. Ooh, I can't either. Oh, there we go. You did it.
I did it. Okay. Sorry about that technical glitch. So that's the first part of how I got to this project. The second part is more personal. So my grandfather was born in Baghdad in 1910. He was raised in a very cosmopolitan Baghdad. He was the descendant of a Jewish community that had lived in Baghdad since the Babylonian exile, so for a very long time. And that Jewish community played a role in the cosmopolitan life that he had grown up in along the Tigris. And this project, in a way, was also partly for me to get more in touch with that Iraqi background that I have, and part on one side of my family. At the same time, though, he was a witness to the Farhud, the pogrom against Jews in 1941, and eventually left Baghdad, initially for Tehran with his family, then to Tel Aviv, and then finally to New York, which is where I was born. And so one of the things that when I think about Iraq, and when I was thinking about the issues that were going on in northern Iraq connected to the video and ISIS takeover at the time, was this kind of homogenization, the breakdown of an incredibly richly cosmopolitan culture towards more and more polarization and homogenization, starting in a sense, at least for me, with my own family, my Jewish family leaving Iraq, but then also one can mention the US-led invasion of Iraq that led to horrible polarization of Shia and Sunni communities, for example, and then in the final moments when I was starting to write this book, the rise of ISIS, which led to more and more homogenization and terrorizing of minority communities. And so the question arose for me, what allows for people with differences to live together? Sort of very basic question, but in a way, perhaps the most basic question of political thought, right? How can different people manage to live together? And what role do images play in that political flourishing? And so these two questions, connected to the sort of my two experiences with this video, came together in then the sort of follow-up questions of why so often do we destroy images? What's involved in iconoclasm, in the smashing of images? What's also involved, by the way, in the making of images of destruction? Because both of these images that I showed you, right, are, we know of these iconoclastic moments, not directly from the iconoclasm, but from the images of iconoclasm that I showed you a moment ago. So why destroy images? Why make images of that destruction? And might there be better ways for us to live with images? How might we better live with images and with each other? So these were the motivating questions that got me started on this project. And I think I'm going to stop there and let the three panelists, who I'm just incredibly honored that each of them has come and been willing to join us for this. And so I'm gonna stop there, and I'm sure we'll be able to discuss more of the details later on.
Thank you, Aaron. So now Wendy Shaw.
Okay, hello everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to share a short presentation, so I'll just pull that up. This was a really amazing book to read. It was both really fun to read and really well-informed. I worked some on this book, and there was something about both Aaron's interests and his style which made me feel like it was a book I had written, except I was learning so much that either I had amnesia in between, or, it was really amazing experience because he was pointing to a lot of issues that I'm very fascinated by, but working them through, in a way very parallel to my interests. So going from that, I thought I would just bring up some of the kinds of issues which come up from his discussion. So the first thought that I had was, if I had to summarize the book, what I found really exciting about it was that it points to this inherent and very anarchic tension between the fact that we feel a need for stable realities and that truth itself is always unstable. And so how do we deal with that? And it sort of creates a theoretical grounding for this as well as a historical grounding. And at first, when you see Isis, and you're of course not talking about the Egyptian god, but you're talking about the modern phenomenon, it looks like it should be about Islam. And with that, it looks like it's something that should be emerging in antiquity and manifesting in modernity. But it turns out that the way in which he analyzes these actions by ISIS, the story that he's telling is actually much more interestingly about the repeated tensions of the political as experienced through the imposition of the universalizing values of modernity. So I just wanted to compare, why am I not, there we go. I wanted to compare two very short quotes. As many people know, Socrates expressed a thought through Plato in which he's not against writing, as many people misunderstand, but that he's suspicious of writing because there's a danger in writing. Writing has this strange feature, like painting. It stands there as if alive, but if you ask it something, it is incapable of either defending or helping itself. So in a lot of Plato's writing, there's a concern that if you fix things, they will become dead. Now, there's something I found really interesting in the Quran as well, which is, oh, and I forgot to write where this is in the Quran. It's in the 3rd surah, I believe 7th verse, but I'm not sure. And the quotation is, some of its verses are definite. These are the mother of the scripture, and others are ambiguous. The perverse at heart eagerly pursue the ambiguous in their attempt to make trouble and pin down a specific meaning of their own. Only God knows the true meaning. So here we have these two cultures which are related that are pointing to the fact that truth is somewhere else. And stability, though it feels like it'll give you a real truth, actually destabilizes the possibility for thinking about truth. It's really in the discourse that you can approach truth but never get there. Now, a funny place where this also comes up is in Alfred Jarry's King Ubu, who says that we shall not have succeeded in demolishing everything unless we demolish the ruins as well. But the only way I can see of doing that is to use them to put up a lot of fine, well-designed buildings. So there's this anarchic impulse in the early 20th century, which again recognizes this artistically. And this destructive sensibility reappears again in Jean-Luc Godard's 1964 film, Band of Outsiders, where a bunch of young people run through the Louvre and they're trying to get through in 9 minutes and 32 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. And really interestingly, they're running through and they run in front of a painting which has now become an icon of the French Revolution, but it's a depiction of the revolution. So it's pointing to how symbols of revolution and of upheaval themselves become icons, and they themselves become some sort of golden calf. And this is interesting in that the museum, the place we preserve things, the place where things get honored, fails to become a neutral space. It also becomes an exclusive space. And this is one of the cartoons that Aaron discusses in his thinking about these issues. There are also sites which become more important because they're destroyed. The Bamyan Buddhas might be thought of in this regard. I'm going a little bit quickly so I don't take too much time. There's also the issue of when things are destroyed. So after, I think it was after the destruction of the museum in Mosul, there was also it was in 2016. There was also the destruction of Palmyra. And many people were deeply mourning the destruction of this World Heritage Site. But this World Heritage Site was created based on another history of destruction, which was that of archaeology and removal of the village, which had been there for several centuries. So one of the questions that this brings up is when you establish something as a monument and give it a fixed meaning like heritage, then what is being erased? What is the cost of that universalization? And of course, this touches very much on who has the right to own things, who has the right to define symbols, how do these symbols function within the political, and also how do spaces that were once famous as dreams, such as the Palmyra of Zenobia, what happens when these spaces become actual physical contested spaces? Of course, this has a lot to do with recent discussions and, of course, the tragedies that have been taking place in France recently. And, of course, there's the issue of, is Islam iconoclastic anyway? And there are many, many pictures of the Prophet. So when there are these discussions of you can't depict the Prophet, you can't have cartoons of the Prophet, there's this repetition of iconoclasm, which of course is taken up by groups like ISIS. But there's another layer which is taking place there, which is that the idea of iconoclasm was initially a defamation of Jews that got transferred onto Muslims. And in addition, there's an insistence on this that the image is something that is universal and means the same thing in all cultures. So one of the issues I think that needs to be raised, and that Aaron really brings up very nicely, is how different populations think about images in varying ways. So of course, this can be taken up in multiple ways, and it becomes less of an issue of an authentic Islam, but how Islam is performed often for political needs. So recently, one of my favorite monuments in Istanbul, the Church of Kora, was covered up in order to be used as a mosque in a very distinct political gesture. Of course, we have several of the people in this talk. We're talking about the ways in which it's very difficult to know how to remove monuments without making them into even more iconic things. Does removing monuments erase history in a positive sense, as in we stop honoring the wrong people? Or does it erase history in that we forget to remember the violence which has been done in the past? How do we deal with the monumentalization of history? And finally, even when we're not thinking of monuments, there are very many symbols that we engage with all the time that become representations of thoughts and ideas and beliefs on a continually sliding scale, so that when we are talking about something being true or something being a representation, we forget that the meaning of that representation has been sliding continually. So if we go back to the monuments that were destroyed in the museum in Mosul, those aren't simply icons that are forbidden in Islam, but rather they are icons of a Western ideology that was propped up through dictatorships and that became symbolic of modern nations. So we need to think about all of these layers of meaning as we think about how symbols produce meaning that speak extremely differently for different populations and different political needs. So what's wonderful about Aaron's book is that it raises all of these issues through an exegetical and philosophical comparison that really pertains to the contemporary era and many of the issues that we have been seeing and addressing, particularly in recent years. So thank you so much for writing the book, Aaron. Really enjoyed reading it. And it was also a pretty quick, easy read. Yay.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So now we have Michael Rakowitz next.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for having me here, everyone at the Vera List Center. Thank you to Sina for the invitation to be presenting through Cabinet's platform. And then also, Aaron, thank you for the book and also for the friendship and also the way in which it's been written. I agree with Wendy. It's actually really very approachable. And I think that there's also a lot of things that are in there that I'm hoping to add to today and to merge some of our shared history as people who come from there and with similar backgrounds, and also to do so with Regine Sahakian, who's another dear friend who I'm very, very honored to be presenting alongside today. I'm going to quickly apologize in advance because if I get interrupted, my wife's been exposed to COVID, so she's quarantining and I'm taking care of our 2 young kids, one of whom is doing bat mitzvah training right now in the other room, and another one that's watching Star Wars in the other. So let's hope that George Lucas can keep the young one entertained, but there might be some interesting breaking of the fourth wall here. Okay, so sharing screen. I wanted to begin today with my own proximity to fractures. This torn photograph bears the traces of sudden traumatic movement. It's one of the few photos that survived my grandparents' departure from Iraq in the 1940s. This photo shows my grandfather, Nissim bin Ishaq Daoud Betaziz, with his family, so large that they extend beyond the frame provided by the desert oasis backdrop. I was 10 years old in 1984 when my grandmother, Renee Shamoun, passed away. She was the last living link in our home to remember Iraq, as my mother was only 2 years old when she emigrated. Months after my grandmother's death, we visited her brother Niazi in London. On that trip, we visited the British Museum, where my mother made a beeline to the Assyrian rooms and sat my brothers and I down on a bench in front of the lion hunt of Ashurbanipal. She showed us how each relief panel showed a sequential scene. She explained to us that it was the first comic book in human history, and then, after a deep breath, declared that it was from the same place she and my grandmother were from, Iraq. There's nothing cooler than seeing the first comic book in human history at age 10, and then learning that your people were responsible for it. And then my mother said, "And what is it doing here?" Her comment tore through me, and what was a museum before had suddenly become a crime palace, holding objects that were in many cases traumatic extractions forcibly parted from the people to whom they belonged. "Look at the gaps," my mother told us. This memory brings me to these photos of an emptied out museum. These are photos of the National Museum of Iraq after it was looted in the wake of the American-led invasion of 2003. One could say that the looting of the Iraq Museum was the first moment of pathos that opened up during the war. It didn't matter if you were for the war or against it. It was not simply a localized Iraqi loss, but a loss for all of humanity, where objects connected to so many of the primal scenes in human existence were at risk. But when the outrage about lost objects did not translate to the outrage about lost lives, I began a project in 2006 called The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist. The centerpiece is an ongoing series of sculptures that attempts to not reconstruct, but reappear life-size the 7,000 plus archaeological artifacts looted from the National Museum of Iraq during the 2003 US invasion, using Middle Eastern food packaging and Arab American newspapers. Unfortunately, this is a project that has also grown to include objects and sites destroyed by groups like ISIS in the wake of the Iraq War, declared over by the US in 2011, but continuing ever more awfully for the Iraqi people. This Assyrian Lamassu, which stood at the Nergal Gate of Nineveh, was destroyed by Daesh in 2015. This is the floor plan of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal's northwest palace of Nimrud, or Kalhu, which was erected in the mid-9th century BC. Its magnificent lamassu and wall reliefs depicting winged genies were painted in antiquity, which is a word that I hate. These are the explosives lined up along the walls of the palace in 2015, seen in a video of its destruction distributed by Daesh. Fragments and torn edges, gaps. Along with my team of assistants, I embarked on a reappearance of room N of the palace, the side room of a banquet hall where Ashurnasirpal II would receive guests. But it was more than just reappearing the entire suite of reliefs that were in this room. It was making the gaps. Here you can see that the majority of reliefs in this one room are located in Western imperial or encyclopedic museums. Indeed, after the site was excavated in the mid-19th century, 400 of the 600 reliefs were extracted and sent to museums in the West and collectors in the West. And so, in these full-scale reappearances of these rooms, I wanted to put the viewer into the position of an Iraqi visiting the palace before it was destroyed, to not only reappear what was destroyed in 2015, but to show the gaps that Iraqis have been forced to see in their own history as a result of the successive removals from foreign powers. A palimpsest of different moments of removals that did not begin nor end with ISIS. Anything that my studio and I built was destroyed, and the full-scale blank spaces detailed what it was taken and where it is now. Pushing against the monochrome that the West loves when pulling statues out of the ground, I insisted on reproducing the colors with which these panels were believed to have been painted, as if blood was returning to the veins in the figures. This particular set of panels shows the way in which the excavators could remove certain parts of the works for collectors and institutions who did not want to pay for the shipping of an entire panel. Realizing that their public would respond to something recognizable, like a head, the excavators developed a technique where they could slice the surface of the carved gypsum stone like a pat of butter. These quote unquote beheadings are given context in the caption that accompanies the panel's reappearance. They dismantled the winged bulls, known as lamasu, as purposefully as any decapitation they carried out in Mosul or the Syrian city of Raqqa. The bearded male heads of the statues are missing, likely taken to be sold on the black market as IS has done with other artifacts. They then wired the entire place with explosives and blew it apart, along with the temples of Nabu and the goddess Ishtar. And that's a quote from Laurie Hinant. Knowing that Daesh was destroying what was too big to sell inconspicuously on the black market gave me a new understanding of those videos of sites being bulldozed and dynamited. The destruction of these reliefs was impossible to disaggregate from the West's insatiable appetite for the objects of the East and global South, while not always, if ever, extending that concern to its people. It was the same way that no one wanted to discuss the layered reasonings for the looting of the Iraq Museum. For some people who looted the museum, these artifacts were their ticket out of the country. When you think about the desperation of living in a country that's been under siege since 1990-91 and endured the harshest sanctions ever visited on a country, and then the bombardment of shock and awe during the war, it seems quite reasonable to want to liquidate the past in order to preserve the present and ensure the future by getting out. But we should also consider how the valuation, pardon me, of those objects reached what it was because the West found them so valuable. They became a commodity, a kind of currency. So when you look at the Northwest Palace of Nimrud or the Lamasu at the Nergal Gate at Nineveh that was destroyed, as well as other colossal structures there, you realize that in some cases, these were really large objects that ISIS would have had a hard time trafficking. I see them as like hostage execution videos that are geared specifically towards the West. This only became more vulgar when you consider that Daesh's destruction of the Northwest Palace of Nimrud was followed in late 2018 by the auctioning of a relief that was in the possession of the Virginia Theological Seminary. The price paid for this relief, $31 million by an anonymous private collector, was enhanced by the demolition of the palace 3 years before. And while the money will be used for the admirable purpose of funding a scholarship at VTS, the auction bolstered further the narrative of Iraq as a site of extraction and speculation. it became clear to me that within reason to ponder that if ISIS approached the world community and said, we're going to destroy the 200 reliefs remaining in the Northwest Palace unless you take them, every country in the world would have opened their borders so that their museums could include these objects in their collections. But if ISIS said, we are going to execute the 200 Iraqis, Assyrians, Yazidis, whomever, living near Nimrud unless you take them, the west borders would have remained closed. But even in all this, I resist the work simply being a polemic about destruction. What survives is important to speak about, whether home in Iraq, in the Balad al-Rafidin, or the diaspora, the materials enlisted to make these works attempt to foreground through a detritus of compost upon which things continue and endure. If I really think about where these materials I use to reappear these artifacts come from, I realize it has a lot to do with me being a child in my grandmother's narrow pantry, looking up at these shelves that seemed enormous to me at the time with all these colorful boxes that contain baharat, the Iraqi spice mix, curries, basmati rice, etc. Some people stand in awe in front of shelves of books, and this was the same thing. That pantry was a different kind of library, a library of diaspora that smelled of cumin, completely sensorial. And I think those connections that we maintain to home lost as refugees or exiles, even with all the trauma experienced, not only marks that loss, but also insists on survival through acts of joy and radical hospitality. I conclude with the exhibition of Room G at the Malmö Konsthall. It was a banquet hall at the time of Ashurnasir Paul II. Malmö has been used recently by politicians and by different leaders around the world to point to the problems of immigration in a very racist way. I think there's about 12,000 citizens in Malmö that are from Iraq, and they're also Syrians, and the racism visited on the population is a microcosm of what's happening everywhere. This is a photo of Lina al-Nahar, an Iraqi living in Malmö who was forced to leave Baghdad in the 1990s. She is a representative of the Swedish Green Party and also the head of the Iraqi Cultural Association of Malmö. She made a speech to commemorate the opening of the exhibition, but also to declare it a living room. With the Iraqi Cultural Association hosting the opening, it actually applied the same critique of the colonial attitude of who has the right to host, which is something the architect Sandi Halal speaks about a great deal, and can be seen activated here in this inversion of the host country being made guests by the local Iraqi population. What had been a banquet courtyard in antiquity suddenly became a banquet courtyard in contemporary time. And then suddenly Iraqi musicians and singers appeared behind me. They wore crowns that represented Queen Puabi's headdress from antiquity. And I think of this akin to my project, where the vitrine can be broken in a different way, with the object returned and used by its people. They performed music for a good hour, and the joy in that space and the clapping that reverberated off the reappeared reliefs felt like an anointing of the space. And here's just a little snippet of what it sounded like that night. And then there were no photos of the events that were really taken that night. So all of these are crowdsourced photos that were taken by the Iraqi community, and they sent them to me. I love all of these filters that people use. I don't have any social media or Snapchat apps myself, but I really like some of these effects that they had applied to the images. This, I guess, is kind of like a Bollywood filter. I don't know about that one, but it's fun. And so with all our conversations about what has been destroyed, I want my project to also afford a space of dignity of what has survived and endures. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. And now we're going to go to our final presentation before we come back to questions. Regine?
Thank you, Sinan. Thank you so much, Michael, for that. I think one thing that Michael notes that's important here is the rise in sales and auctions that came out of the destruction of Iraq. And for those who are interested in contemporary art, the entire Middle East art market as this really lucrative site of sales emerged from the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and saw its sort of meteoric rise with the kind of sort of liquefaction of the countries from Syria and Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and others. And so I think it's sort of important to look at the links here. One thing that Aaron talks about is this, the importance of imperial interests intertwined with aesthetic debates. And so when we're looking at images like this, especially of things like the initial image of how eerily similar the ISIS video looks to the relief, it's also important to look at what the image of ISIS emerged from, which is, of course, a political kind of back and forth that is framed from the initial invasion of Iraq, which was the sort of clash of civilizations. Also, when we're talking about images, particularly with Iraq, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 also began with hundreds of millions of dollars put into a media campaign and a proliferation of images. So that were intended to be produced through private contracting. So when we look at the images that are produced and imperial ambitions and whatever ISIS, however people want to define ISIS, what we're really looking at also is the rise of contemporary warfare, which is proxy warfare, privatized armies and contractors, and sort of vying multinational interests that are very obvious in the region for us to sort of see. So this is sort of maybe an exploration of some of the visuals that have gone along with it. So that kind of political analysis sort of has to take place to understand where that image of that ISIS brings comes from. It does look similar because it was made to look similar. Those are actually the objects from the museum. You know, they're in this kind of costume dress in order to make this a dramatic video. And when we talk about the manufacturing of videos, I think it's important also to note that the current president of Iraq, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, comes out of the US plans for war, the hundreds of millions of dollars in contracting the Iraqi media group that Kadhimi was a recipient of and organized, and is currently the president today. So there's like a long relationship and interchange between these two things. And I think I'm going to start with a video of John Kerry at the Met Museum. If you'll just bear with me, I'm going to share my screen here. And this video is from the Met in 2014. And this video basically comes after the images of destruction that, that we all saw and are discussing.
A tragedy for the Syrian and the Iraqi people. These acts of vandalism are a tragedy for all civilized people. And the civilized world must take a stand. So what is really at stake here? When you walk around the exhibit, the limestone reliefs from Assyria or the Syro-Hittite sculptures, you get an up-close and personal reminders of the power of human creation. Each artifact tells a story, a human story, our story. But we also know this: when ISIL destroys dozens of shrines in Mosul, or the historic Han statues in Raqqa, when Assad's forces shell the Roman temple of Del and Palmyra, or care more about regaining territory in Aleppo than protecting its ancient treasures, we are all bearing witness to a cultural barbarism at its worst. Ugly, savage, inexplicable, valueless barbarism. It's not just that the forces of extremism threaten to take us back to the Stone Age. Extremists want to rob future generations of any connection to this past. That is profoundly what is at stake. And if you leave it unstopped, if you don't stand up, we're all complicit.
So I show this video not to say that the destruction that ISIS engaged in was not brutal, was not savage and horrible and disgusting, but to point out that this was in 2014. So this comes after almost 2 decades of Iraqis being ripped apart from their homes, their lands, their bodies, their families, their livelihoods, and their own history. None of the talk here, of course, speaks to the immense cultural heritage destruction that took place during the invasion of Iraq, or during the earlier war, during the Gulf War, or during the sanctions era, which was when a lot of looting of antiquity sites first started, because there was so much desperation and poverty in some of these more rural areas. And so the ISIS video really comes, I think when we talk about ISIS, we have to be careful about equating it simply in terms of religion, because ISIS is and was a multinational force that was operating with tacit approval and funding from a number of players, governmental players, and funders. So, they were operating across 2 different countries, operating national banks, oil pipelines, and sort of opening up regions for exploitation and extraction. And part of their, very, very well-funded media apparatus was this kind of very sort of horror glamour of a death cult, and this sort of made them something that some people did respond to, people who do believe in supremacy, people who are interested in violence, in systematic rape, in murder, in money, guns, cash, whatever. There are many people who will subscribe to this, and ISIS was very, very good at creating images that could also monopolize and manipulate religious ideologies, but did not hide what it was really about. And I want to point that out, because while many in the West saw these videos of sort of idol destruction, many people also who are in the Middle East saw other videos of Iraqis being shot and killed, murdered in mass graves, raped, tortured. So this was not, there were plenty of other videos that weren't simply idols or images of destruction like this. There was no secret what ISIS was sort of about. So some of the other discussions of ISIS are about their media images using first-person shooter games. And I think in the book, Aaron rightly discusses how there's sort of these ways that they take from first-person shooter games to create their own, noting that a lot of that comes from the first Gulf War. I just want to add that the technology for the war did not come the games did not come after images of smart bombs used during the first Gulf War. Gaming was actually developed in order to make that Gulf War happen. So sim technology, which is simulator, network simulation gaming, was developed by the Department of Defense. It was a $300 million project to create the SimNet system. And this is what, sort of started the billion-dollar gaming industry, World of Warcraft, and so on and so forth. So the person who started that exercise was the simulation exercise, and the lead up to the Persian Gulf War was Norman Schwarzkopf. And he would become the sort of infamous general who led the Persian Gulf War. And so when we talk about images and images of destruction through gaming, I want to point out how the destruction and loss of Iraqi life was already presented prior to games being such a huge phenomenon, but cemented through the first Gulf War. And so I'm just going to show the next slide here. This is a press conference in '91 with Schwarzkopf showing a press corps, a room full of journalists, something at the end of his conference that he thought was funny. He called this the luckiest man in Iraq.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
So, the person driving that car probably did not survive, but that's sort of besides the point in this video. It's a funny joke, and I think when we talk about religion, we also have to talk about political ideology as a religion. And I think that a case could definitely be made that one of the strongest ideologies or religions in the United States for the past few decades has been the sort of desecration and viewing of the destruction of Iraqi life, and that kind of those images really unifying people in a certain kind of way. If we even look at pictures of Abu Ghraib, that figure of the hooded person is an iconic figure, not because anything of consequence actually happened for those who were tortured or those who were on the upper chains of command, but because it was this incredible image of subordinated Iraqi life and bodies. So I think that it's, a lot of what we were able to see from Iraq is also from this American approach. And in the 90s, the effects of these wars that we saw on these grainy screens, because there was this sort of closure of Iraq as a country, we weren't able to see the sort of things that emerged or the many artists and people who were working in Iraq itself over the past few decades. One woman who is a survivor of the Gulf War, during this time of the Persian Gulf War, experienced an American bomb that shattered and went off very close to her home. She hid behind the staircase and nothing happened to her home. They weren't hurt. They weren't physically hurt. But her body, because of the fear that she experienced from the sound of the explosion, her back and the nerves in her back actually transformed and she was never able to walk again. She's 84 years old and has not been able to walk since. So I think this question of image destruction is important. Is that an image of image destruction? If I took an X-ray of her back and put it in a museum, would it be? These are some of these things that we don't know because the images that we've been saturated with are very, very one-sided and still haven't had a chance to emerge. So I want to just quickly point out this question of museums and what we're able to see in various museums. This is a picture of the protests, an image from one of the protests that started last year, the sort of nationwide protests in Iraq, which were against the kind of immense corruption and polarization of Iraq that had taken place since the war, and really fighting back against this idea of sectarianism, which again is a kind of for-profit scheme of buying groups to retain and control power that was opened up through the kind of power vacuum and voids of the various wars and occupations. So this is an image of the bridge that goes to the Green Zone, which houses the American Embassy, the largest in the world, the Iraqi government and parliament buildings, and a number of contractors. And I wanted to bring this up because the protests were itself, I believe, a kind of image destruction, destroying this image of Iraq as a sectarian, impossible place for people to live together, or where there wasn't a desire for this. This was a completely grassroots, has-been youth-led movement of people who, despite nearly 1,000 young people being killed by militia and military forces, are still out protesting and fighting for a more unified and just corruption-free Iraq. So this is just some of the pictures, and in the book, Aaron also discusses some of the imagery that was used from sort of Babylonian imagery to talk about the strength. And I want to mention a lot of different artworks and sort of graffiti and things were used here. Again, I think because this is part of Iraqi heritage and people know this, and in the areas of Mosul and surrounding areas where ISIS came in, Assyrians do still live there. They do still speak their language. People are very aware of their history, and because of the isolation of many Iraqis, they have only had that sort of modern and ancient period to work with. So I think this also comes out of a political reality as well. So this is a protest from another side. So you see the sort of green zone, which is this area of safety, comfort, extreme wealth, and the rest of the city where ordinary Iraqis live. And again, this was a grassroots, mostly working and middle class revolution by the youth, asking for change and demanding change and a more unified government and society. And I would mention against extreme force. The last,
the mask. Oh my gosh, all of them.
So this image that I want to show, I bring up the protests because at the same time that the protests were happening, MoMA PS1 launched a very large building-wide exhibition, Theater of Operations, the Iraq Wars. And two of the artists in the show were, Iraqi artists in their 20s who had recently left Iraq to study art in outside countries, but were very much still tied to the area and had created the work that was exhibiting in the museum during their time living in Iraq. I put this up because this is another sort of way that we see an image destruction in the eyes of the artist. So the artist who created this, his name is Ali Iyal, and this is an image on Instagram. So when we talk about the way that Facebook or social media sort of manipulates images, we don't actually need to tear apart an image to have it be destroyed in the eyes of the artist. So Ali saw this on Instagram, and there was a post from MoMA PS1 saying, we were open on Veterans Day, and admission is free to all active duty military personnel, for veterans of all active duty military personnel, and sort of advertising the Gulf War. So Ali, who lived through the wars, was extremely disturbed by this and felt that it had sort of destroyed this artwork in his eyes. The artwork that is here comes out of the experiences he had in Iraq, where one of his brother-in-law was killed actually fighting ISIS in the Iraqi army. And instead of wanting to do a memorial to him because of how tired he was of all the memorials and deaths around him, he decided to embroider the dreams of his family members and loved ones onto pillowcases. So Ali experienced a very different idea of Iraqi soldiers or veterans. In America, there's a very different experience. There may be, sort of seen as victims of American policy and that kind of thing, which is fine. But for Ali, someone who experienced the occupation firsthand, who was living at the time in Mahmoudiyah, which was sort of made famous because it was the place where one of the worst atrocities committed by American soldiers in Iraq took place. An infantry unit that was patrolling the area raped a 14-year-old girl and burned her entire house down alongside her younger siblings and parents. They were all burned alive in the home. So this was had an enormous effect, apart from the fact that Iraqis were subjugated to house searches, extreme brutality, and obviously the violence of these wars, which have caused nearly 1 million deaths and many other millions more to be displaced and further brutalized by other armies and forces such as ISIS. So this image for Ali became a destroyed work of art because it was used to advertise the American military in Iraq. It no longer became an artwork for him. So I think it's important to look at the different ways that art and images can be destroyed and the meanings that they hold. There was another sort of, and this was apart from the other protests that happened, which is that Michael was also involved in, regarding the leadership at MoMA and Leon Black, the president of the board, and whose son, Joshua Black, is on the board of MoMA PS1. So he has acquired a large conglomerate of private mercenary military groups, including the one formerly known as Blackwater and many others who work in Iraq actively in 30 countries around the world. He's also since been sort of in the news because of his ties to like $50 million ties to Jeffrey Epstein, going to strip clubs with Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason that there was some discord about his leadership at MoMA PS1 was because of this acquiring of these mercenary groups that were doing this kind of harm in Iraq and elsewhere. And so Ali Yas, another artist in the show, on the last day wanted to have a peaceful sort of protest that would destroy his artworks. The museum intervened at the last minute when they found out and pulled the works from the show. And so the demonstrators sort of did their own, used copies of the works. And he was there via Berlin on an iPad, sort of making a statement about how he felt that his work was used and that how uncomfortable he was by the lack of sort of care at the museum or response to its leadership and the funding, the many millions of dollars that had gone to the museum that were in part due to these kinds of funds. At any rate, whether you agree or not, you know, artists' protests have a long history at MoMA. There has even been a huge exhibition of artists protesting at MoMA in 2015. But for Ali, as an Iraqi, his work was pulled. He was not able to actually have the protest without the museum calling in the NYPD, something that is highly unusual and was highly unnecessary, considering the fact that the museum already has their own security and that this activist group was a peaceful group, was familiar to the museum, and was engaging in a sort of peaceful action by the artist to transform his work for a purpose. So I think we also have to look at the destruction of artwork and when it's actually destroying an artwork to pull it and prevent an artist from being able to actually voice their purpose for showing or making a modification to their art. And the role of the museum in policing or silencing other voices or trying to sort of silence any kind of criticism towards the ways that their collections are pursued, where their monies are coming from, and this sort of ties to capital and the loss of life that of course is very rife within the art world, and particularly in the contemporary art world of the Middle East, and has grave consequences considering that we were talking about a country that has gone through a genocide, you know, for for a very long time now. The one other thing that I would just want to show is, you know, there's a lot of images of the, if I can here, it might take a little too long, but there are a number of images of, you know, people's families. I want to point out, when you Google Iraq now for images, this is all you see. Soldiers, arms, flags, right? This is obviously the entire image has changed. And there is an artist who, there have been attempts like this Iraq Photo Archive, which is a project from the University of Glasgow, from Cyril Basil El-Rawi, to show different images from his own family. And I think this is something we see in Aaron and Michael's pictures, and in many Iraqis I know as well, who have this desire to share this other time when they and their families could live and enjoy in their homes. And here, one of the first images are these images of going to these sites. It's a tourist site and different families. And this is something that different Iraqis can contribute to. I point this out not because the images are totally unfamiliar or different for me, at least, or for other Iraqis, but because the enormity of the replacement of images of Iraq to this there's a saying in Iraq, amongst many Iraqis, like Iraq is gone, and there is this attempt to kind of reconfigure it or put it back together again. Iraq is not, obviously is never going to return to the place that it was, but has gone through these many changes. But if we're looking at images and the religions and ideologies that play a role in transforming them, and that are transforming many other parts of the world as we speak into sites of urban military proxy warfare, we have to look at where this kind of war over images and polarization has started in terms of how we fight wars today. And Iraq is that site. So thank you.
Thank you, Regine. Thanks very much for that presentation. So I think at this point, we'll ask a couple of questions, Ariola and I, and then we will, I know there are a lot of other questions that have come up in the chat already, and we will start to field some of those. Ariola, would you like to go first, or should I ask a question?
Why don't you go ahead first, and I'll spotlight everyone quickly.
Okay. So I have a question, actually, Aaron. You and I have talked a little bit about this, about the status of what counts as an image in the book. And maybe this would be an opportunity also for you to tell us a little bit more about how the book stages the relationship between politics and images. For you, images are vital for anything that is called politics, and any attempt to imagine a world without images is an attempt to imagine a world beyond the politics. And there, in the early sections of the book, you talk about Moses and Aaron and the sort of particular scene of the golden calf and the destruction of the golden calf by Moses. And it's very interesting there because via Al-Farabi, a 9th, 10th century scholar, you talk about how Al-Farabi talks about music itself as being a prelude of some kind to politics. So by that, you bring in the question of non-mimetic forms of images. So music itself might count, and you talk about arabesques, and you talk about non-representational, non-mimetic forms of art. But there's an earlier scene where you also talk about the action of destroying something outside of any representation of it, any recording of it, as being itself an image. So via Schoenberg's opera on Aaron and Moses, you talk about that very destruction of the golden calf as being an image of some kind. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what qualifies exactly as an image, where, in a world where actions themselves can be an image. I was wondering what the thresholds are for images that have a relationship to politics and the making of a political world.
Thanks, Sina. So there's a lot there, and I could speak for a long time, and I'm going to try not to do that. But let me try and address a little bit, frame a little bit more how, or at least give a few more suggestions about how I try to frame these issues in the book. The first thing I suppose I can say is that, as you mentioned, I talk about images as necessary for political life, by which I mean this sort of attempt to fashion a way for a plurality to live together, not a homogeneity, right? But actually, we, as human beings, we are different, and yet we want to be able to live together in some kind of flourishing way. And I think that I tried to show using the philosophy of Al-Farabi, who you mentioned in the first chapter, to show the fact that no political community can exist without images that direct the members of the community towards some type of shared values and shared ideals, that also gives some type of purpose for following the law. So you talk about when you asked about music and the preludes, right? So, well, the idea of preludes in this Farabi takes from Plato in Plato's Laws, is that the law on its own is not lovable, that one doesn't follow the law, follow restrictions on oneself just just for its own sake, but rather one needs to have a kind of commitment to it. And that commitment for Farabi comes from images that have been provided for the political community to give it some type of reason for being, right? And commitment to being. And so on the one, right, so from that perspective, we can't have a political community without images. But the flip side of this, right, is that all images, as I try to suggest in the book, right, are necessarily partial. They're all necessarily false, and therefore they're all, in a sense, idols. It's interesting that in the Quran, the words for idol and image in the passage of that's quoted in the ISIS video are interchangeable. Ibrahim hates these images because for him, all images are idols because all images necessarily leave something out. They choose to focus attention in one direction, and there's always another story. There's always another perspective that's available. And so what I'm struggling with, or in the book, and also try to get a readership to struggle with, is that struggle with images of the needing to sort of engage with them in this double way. On the one hand, recognizing that any kind of hope or longing to escape the false element of images, to escape into a kind of perfect redemption or a perfect political world in which nothing false will exist, is a fantasy, and I try to argue a destructive fantasy. And yet at the same time, we don't want to be fully subservient to images. So in a sense, the book, I think at the deepest level, is actually an argument for a kind of pedagogy, a kind of individual ability to to cultivate a kind of criticism towards the images that we live with, and at the same time, the recognition that there are those images. So in order to also kind of dampen any type of messianic longings to escape images. And so that's the dialectic that I try to deal with in the book. I mean, I maybe stop there. I think that the example you brought and that I talk about in the introduction of Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron is a wonderful work that engages this. It was also fun for me to be able to talk about it first because my very first published piece of writing, which I published in the undergraduate Journal of Jewish Studies of the University of Chicago, is a piece on Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron. So it was a nice way to bring that into this work, hopefully somewhat more mature work. But anyway, we can maybe talk about that in conversation or whatever. Hopefully does that at least start to get at your question?
Yes, that's, yeah.
Jump in here. One of the things that I think I found very powerful, but also struggled a little bit towards the end of the book, is this point that you just raised, Aaron, which is that we can't live in a regime without images, nor can we find images that aren't the work of human hands, and in that case also of political ideologies. And so you say that the best thing that we can do is to embrace the ongoing task of deciding which imperfect images to live with. And I've been trying to think of how do we live with imperfect images? What does that really require? And I think coming back to Michael's work, or even some of the ways in which Regine talked about the way that if you type into Google now Iraq, what you kind of see is this over militarized way of representing an entire country. But then the ways in which there is something that is being done, or sort of ways in which you can kind of reclaim that space of these imperfect images and sort of jamming that, I suppose. So if you can speak a little bit about, well, what does it really require to live with imperfect images?
Humility and a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard. I mean, I think that it's an always hard task. But I think that the alternative is not. I mean, to put it in highfalutin terms, I think the alternative is not worthy of us as human beings, because it means to live in a lie of much more comfortable certainty, and it's also a certainty that that even if one frames it as to oneself as the most open position, I think it's always it's a kind of certainty that denies the validity of other voices and other voices. For us to really talk about diversity and plurality and other voices means that we need to be able to accept those other voices as fundamentally in disagreement with us. To agree to desire a kind of diversity with everyone who agrees with us is not quite up to the task, it seems to me. And so for me, this question is that this constant, it's a constant need for using the very, very weak capacities that we have as human beings. I mean, so I'm sorry, I guess my position is a very sobering one. At the very best, the best we have is a kind of limited, imperfect capacity for human judgment, and we can try to do that, and we can try to work with other people towards making imperfect regimes that might not meet our highest aspirations, but I think that they're also the ones that we're going to find that we're capable of actually living together in. At least that's or at least I mean, in a way, I don't even necessarily want to answer that question so much as, I mean, the reason I don't explicitly deal with it in the book is that I think that the book is aimed to try and get us each individually to struggle with that question. And if that, if in reading the book, we come to see that some of our certainties might not be as certain, and we're able to somehow live in a little bit more of that uncertain zone, which ISIS calls the gray zone, which is precisely the zone that ISIS wants to eradicate, right? ISIS talks, and talk about this in the introduction, ISIS talks explicitly about eradicating that gray zone so that the whole world is divided into two very, very clear camps. And each of those camps would has clear images that unite those camps, and one view from, no matter which camp you're in, right? Either you view your own images as fully true, and you view the other images as entirely false. And what I'm trying to do, right? And I think that this also connects to, as was talked about, that way in Regine, in the opening video of the Kerry video, of using that dichotomy of civilization versus barbarism, I think is just exactly that same tendency to want to go into that kind of polarized dualism or dichotomy. And I suppose that at its heart, the book is trying to get us to think about ways that we can escape from that position into the gray zone, which is for me precisely the space where we can actually be political beings.
Mm-hmm. I think something that hasn't come up from the book that maybe you might want to think, following up on this, talk about a little bit more, is this idea of tapping images against each other. Because I actually found that then out of that frustration that I mentioned earlier, then came this sort of way of opening up, or kind of making room for something else, and sort of not necessarily destroying images, but learning how to live with them by tapping them against each other. And if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Sure. So you're referring to this in a sense, image that I present of tapping. And I think that it's important to recognize that I'm precisely producing an image there that I'm borrowing and adapting to my own purposes from Nietzsche's late work. And where, I mean, for Nietzsche, the idols that he suggests that one can tap are the idols of Western metaphysics. But I felt that one could use this image profitably beyond that, right? Which is that he suggests that one could turn the hammer into a kind of tuning fork, right? And you can tap out the hollowness of the image without necessarily destroying it. And in a sense, I'm not claiming that there's never a time for destroying images. There might be. But one of the things that I did want to suggest, right, is that in the book is how so often destroying images really is the production of new images. And so it creates a kind of cycle, right? And I want to suggest that there are times when we want to be able to take a step back from that cycle, and that tapping is that image for me of the capacity. And perhaps I think this is really a capacity that we can't do communally. This is really an individual capacity for what Arendt, I think, would call thinking, of taking a step back and seeing the hollowness, or as I put it before, the partiality of every image, the fact that every image is always leaving something out, and there's always some other possibility, at least one, usually many other possible ways of seeing things that the image is veiling, right? And so the last thing I guess I can mention, which is how I end the book, is by talking about how by putting different images together next to each other, we can tap them against each other. And so that's in a way what I try to do throughout the book by bringing a whole range of different images, just as wonderfully a number of the speakers before have done. One can bring these images together and they end up helping reveal what left on their own those images try to conceal, right? And I think that that's a really worthwhile practice for us to try to cultivate.
Hi, Ariola. So do we have some questions from the chat? I can also ask a second question for Wendy if we want to still sift through the chat, but it's up to you.
Please go ahead and ask your question. I'll see if there's any more from the chat you might want to bring in.
So I have a question, Wendy, for your very brief moment when you talked about how it's a misunderstanding that Islam has a ban against images, and certainly in Shia Islam, which I know from my father and from growing up in Iran, there were lots of images of Muhammad around in Iran in very unordinary places. They might have been hanging from a taxi driver's rear view mirror. They weren't necessarily in exalted places even. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the history of how this idea came to be that Islam, wholesale bans images of the Prophet. And you also talked about how this comes originally from an anti-Semitic line. Maybe I misunderstood you there. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about that history.
I'll do a tiny plug for my own book, which is right here. And I talk about this at length here. My colleague, Christiana Gruber, also has a wonderful book about this, which I showed on that one slide. And I'll just go back to that so that we can see it. Let's see. Here we are, my PowerPoint, share. So the basic issue is that the first time that there was an overarching fatwa about the image came in the 13th century, which is around 600 years after Islam was established. So it's not a foundational thing. And the way in which Islamic law functions scholars can issue fatwas, but they're not necessarily law unless they are used in a court. And then they establish precedent. So one would need to study the extent to which the fatwa was engaged. So that was a fatwa by al-Nawawi in the 13th century. And if you think of somebody like Ibn al-Taymiyyah, who is the primary scholar towards whom the very conservative groups of our own era, including the Wahhabis, and by extension, in certain ways, even ISIS, goes to. Ibn al-Taymiyyah never talks about images. He says there shouldn't be images on graves. Now, in the modern period, modern scholars, in their attempt to classify Islam, established a normative idea that there are a group of hadith, which are sayings of the Prophet, which indicate a conservative approach towards images, what became called an image prohibition. However, there isn't a body of scholarship in Islamic scholarship that brings these hadith together. So when one says the hadith indicate this, that is only the case if modern European scholars take on the role of Islamic scholars and interpret the hadith in a way that it was never interpreted in the Islamic historical period. So that's one part of that. The reason I said that it's related to anti-Semitism is in late 19th century Germany, the word Bilderverbot was used to describe the Jews. And so I find it very interesting how this word, which was initially a description, at least let's say, of the difference of the Jews, became transferred to an overarching rule for Islam where there was no overarching rule. Now, that's not to say that there weren't concerns. And as you mentioned, these concerns developed differently in different groups of Muslims. So modern Shiites use images much more easily than modern Sunnis. However, these groups were not always entirely separate. Their histories of separation and segregation are very political, as Regine indicated, as in Iraq today. You know, these are differences which are played up often for political reasons, and that's true historically as well. When it comes to images of the Prophet, here you can see a painting which is from around 1500, and you can see the face of the Prophet. And there are numerous of these. If you want to see more of these, there's a wonderful study by my colleague, Christy Gruber, the praiseworthy one. You can also find, she's written about this several times for Newsweek. And so, you know, that's a really great summary to just get right away. Yeah, so one of the things that I think one needs to think about in this, of course, this has been coming up an immense amount because of the cartoon controversy and because of what's been happening in France. And obviously, there's no way of excusing the kinds of tragedies that take place with this kind of crazy people who go and attack people. Now, I'm phrasing it that way rather than saying terrorist because of the green light that often happens when some other people go crazy and attack people in the United States, because we don't know if these are lone actors or not. But the thing that I find really interesting is the notion that people keep repeating that Muslims are insulted because one should never represent the Prophet. There are many representations of the Prophet, including on the Supreme Court of the United States, which was approved by the Al-Azhar in Cairo. So what's happening with the cartoons is these aren't respectful images of the Prophet. These are cartoons that are equivalent to anti-Semitic tropes in magazines that are insulting to a minority. And so people, I think it's not about icons are forbidden, but that these images are insulting. So it's interesting that the legitimate thing of, hey, don't insult us, these are racist, becomes a trope of you're iconoclasts and you have no right to be iconoclasts. So the speech gets erased through the discourse of freedom of speech.
Thank you.
Sina, if I can just add to what Wendy was just saying. So first of all, if I can make a little bit of a plug, if you're interested, on November 23rd, I'll actually be in conversation with Christy Gruber. and Omer Hamarshah, another art historian, through Anamed in Istanbul. And so we'll be talking about that more. But more to the point about I just wanted to make a point about the Bilderverbot that Wendy mentioned, the German conception of it, which is interesting because, yes, associated mainly with the Jews. Kant in the Third Critique refers there, as a result of it, to the Jews as the most sublime people, precisely because they can live without images, supposedly, which is interesting. So it's not only a negative, right? In certain strands of German philosophical discourse, it's presented as this, ultimate ideal. And it's precisely just this one place to bring it back to the Schoenberg, Moses and Aaron, where I think the Moses in Moses, Schoenberg and Aaron is precisely trying to live up to that ideal of pure logos, pure thought, with no image. And of course, Schoenberg, I think the artist is recognizing the impossibility of that, right? And so the work, I think, very interestingly narrates or depicts that breakdown, and yet at the same time also depicts the right. So yeah, no, we'll just leave it at that.
I could disagree, but I won't take more time.
I would love to afterwards.
Okay.
There's a question from the audience. It's actually a question I also had for you, Michael. You mentioned briefly that you hate the word antiquity, and I think people in the audience would like to know a little bit more about that and if there's a word you prefer using instead.
Well, I don't know that I have another word to offer, but I hate the word antiquity when it gets applied to Iraq because it implies old or former. That's the way it's defined. And these are all things that are connected to a larger vector of history, and to render them dead and ancient or antique is such a kind of an assault on the image of Iraqis as a kind of continuance, as an identity that is not relegated to the vitrines of museums. I find it incredibly insulting, and also it limits. Regine Sahakian has been, teaching a new generation of Iraqis, of Iraqi artists, who deal with their heritage, but they also deal with their heritage, not something that's like just nostalgia. Not that nostalgia is a problem. I mean, nostalgia comes from like the Greek, nostos, and of home, and algos of pain. That sounds pretty, kind of precise when you talk about Iraq, right? But at the same time, it can also be a blueprint for how we move forward, because everything has been just a series of interruptions when it comes to the history of Iraq, and also its place in modernity. And not only Regine, speaking about this, but also somebody like Dr. Nada Shabut, who is like time and again, just courageously put forward the fact that nobody talks about the modern and contemporary work that was destroyed in the aftermath of the US-led invasion. So this is one of the reasons why I hate the term. Not that anybody can't use it. It's not like something that I'm going to, drive to eradicate, but I think that we need to be more thoughtful and more precise when we choose these terms.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Christine Corey to ask a question that she has for the panelists, and perhaps for you, Michael. Christine, are you?
I'm here, thanks. Well, thanks everyone for this generous discussion. My question was about the proliferation of these reconstruction and 3D reconstruction projects of these sites. So I was just curious if any of you want to share some views of thinking about how this connects to the work that you're doing, and especially kind of when it comes to thinking about capital and tech around these very fancy, expensive projects. So just curious about kind of this lineage of these digital reproductions and then remanifestations into physical objects, again, kind of as a foil to Michael's work. Thanks.
I guess maybe I'll just start off talking about that if nobody else is jumping in. I'm thinking in particular of the arch in Palmyra. And I think, as Regine and Michael both talked about, often these reproductions tend to be a way of asserting a certain kind of ownership over heritage that is universalizing and reproducing it in a way that, you know, places can be rebuilt, people can't. And so again, these sorts of mass productions of the virtual often come to be, it seemed to me that they come to be a reply to, it's okay to have a certain amount of destruction because we can rebuild virtually, we can have the replacement. And it again becomes a way of legitimating the kinds of destruction that are happening in war. We haven't really talked at all about the arms sales that enable all of this incredible amount of destruction, and through which a lot of countries that aren't very immediately apparently involved are actually extremely involved. So all of this sort of desire for the virtual becomes a way of imagining a world where the human, again, sort of is pushed even more into the background, in contrast with the destruction that gets a lot of discussion.
I also want to add to Wendy, if you watch the entire John Kerry speech at the end, he talks about all of the funding that the State Department is going to be giving to different nonprofits and sort of institutions to train Iraqis on heritage, to train conservators, to try to sort of do things to assist in sort of recovering or reconstructing some of these sort of sites. So it kind of gets used again as a way to show the sort of care after the fact, and sort of glosses over the fact that all of these sites were sort of known to be heritage sites at the start of the war and were not taken care of, but then becomes this kind of tool, like ideological tool, with, you know, millions of dollars towards these institutions for training and that kind of thing. And there isn't really, like many of the contracting opportunities in Iraq, we don't necessarily know what those outcomes are, how much people are helped. And that's apart from the issues that Wendy brings up, that the people who actually live in those sites have been more often permanently cut off from those areas, and from those sort of artifacts or relics, or, you know, and I want to include the land also, because the people living there are indigenous people of Iraq. So being forced out of those areas isn't just a removal of antiquities and those sites, but a removal of indigenous populations from their ancestral homeland. So that's, you know, also something that's never going to be sort of repaired through these sort of virtual reproductions. And, you know, I think I'm not going to speak for Iraqis necessarily, but there is very little funding for any sort of reparations or restitutions to those who have been sort of, whose lives and livelihoods have been ruined by the kind of forces that were allowed in. So there's always that question of funding and what gets seen and what doesn't. Really quickly, I also want to mention, in terms of the contemporary and modern art, an example that Erin brings up in the book is when one of the overseers at the British Museum first sees the relics coming in, and he says, "It looks like very bad art." In 2003, The Atlantic published an article from P.G. O'Rourke, and I maybe it was supposed to be funny. It was like, it's called "How I Saved Modern Iraqi Art," and it starts off with the sentence, "Why is Iraq so easy to harm and so difficult to help?" And it goes on to really paint Iraqis as this very pretty horrible and savage group of people who can't help but kind of screw themselves over, and then be unable to be assisted by Americans or any other sort of civilizing force. And he goes to the Museum of Modern Iraqi Art and is supposedly part of helping save the works. And he sees it and he quotes one of the sergeants saying, "It's all very bad art." So there's this replication of those same kinds of terms to denigrate the modern or contemporary work. I mean, we don't really even see contemporary work coming out of Iraq because no curator is going to go there, or most won't, so we don't really see much that's coming out of there. And also the conditions of art making and education in general in Iraq are not, don't make that kind of work very feasible or possible, including issues of mobility and so on. But I think that when we look at that, how things are termed and how we decide on what is valuable and what isn't, we see these same kinds of comments and sort of cycles of violence and denigration, and it comes up even in that description of modern or contemporary art. Modern art, which is now in Iraq being auctioned off for pretty high prices since it's become sort of more lucrative with its rarity and with the uptick of collectors in the Middle East, and the injections of capital that the wars have enabled. But I think it's really instructive to look at even what people assume to be the left, like The Atlantic, were writing about Iraq and its cultural possibilities or value during the time of the invasion itself, and not just from today.
Just thank you, Regina. I just want to add, though, I mean, it seems just to, what I did try to do in the book is try to show the different sides, right? So you quote the British trustee of the British Museum saying it's very bad art, right? But also at the same time, the catalog to the traveling exhibition from 1965, which opens with the line, "For good painting in the Arab world, you have to go to Baghdad," right? That's 1965. It's not, so I'm just trying, there is a mixture. Obviously, yes. I mean, you know much more about this than I do in terms of contemporary art being made, not contemporary Iraqi art, but contemporary Iraqi art being made in Iraq at the moment. But I was glad to be able to include at least a discussion of some of, as you pointed out during the protests last year, and my editor allowed me to get a final paragraph into the book before, even though it was already basically on its way to proofs, which was to at least mention how a number of images were coming out, artistic images distributed not through art galleries, rather they were distributed through Instagram and Twitter, but nevertheless, I think works of powerful images that were being produced on the ground during those protests. So I just, I want to make sure that, we get the different, the multivalent picture there.
Great. We have one more question from the audience, and then I'll turn it to you, Sina, for any last questions, and then we can conclude there. We have a question from Jake Sol Davison, who asks, "I'm curious what might be an elephant in the room. Humans no longer produce the images that have been outsourced to synthetic intelligence. This has been true at least since Harun Faraki's film work on the Gulf War and so forth, operational images. Are there thoughts on the non-human image as it relates to how heritage is mis or understood?" Aaron, I think this might be for you.
Okay, well, I can take it. Well, then I'll take up at least a part of it. I think that there's a lot there worth thinking about. So the final part of the book is precisely about the digitization, right? The final chapter is called Videos, and the final part of that chapter is about mainly Facebook. I've been accused of being an old fogey, in that the book focuses on Facebook, and I guess I have to admit that. But at least autobiographically, it is where I first saw the ISIS video, which is part of the reasons why I focus on it. But there's one line by the technologist Jaron Lanier that I quote in the book, which is, "Digital technology is really just people in disguise." And yes, for sure, there's a lot to think about in terms of digitization and how things are moving in that direction. But I think it's also important to realize with Lanier that in certain fundamental ways, the digital technology is just people in disguise. And therefore, to say that humans are not responsible, but that it's just the algorithm that's responsible. I think what is to repeat the line, for at least in my mind, it reiterates the line that not me, but the other Aaron, my namesake, the biblical Aaron says when Moses accuses him of having made the golden calf, Aaron, this is in Exodus 32, says, I threw in the gold and out came this calf, fully denying human, his artistry, right? That it's to deny the fact that that this is a work of human hands, and there's a long tradition of that kind of denial. And so, for me at least, thinking on one of these people who thinks on a 5,000 year canvas, so to speak, right? I see that the issues of technology and algorithms do repeat other issues that have been coming up throughout human history, and I think that it's interesting and worthwhile to think about in those terms.
Thank you.
I should say, by the way, maybe one of the many things I really love about Michael's work is that he doesn't hide that artistry at all. And I think that that's one of the things that's so wonderful about the work that he showed, which I had the pleasure of being able to see in Malmo, right, is how ambiguous it is, and it doesn't engage in that kind of denial at all.
If there are no more questions, I have one small question from Michael. Michael, what is your companion's name?
This is my son, Jude.
Hello.
Which means generosity in Arabic, but my wife also has a thing for Jude Law, so, and I'm also a huge Beatles fan, so I was okay with it. So it's, yeah.
Thank you. And if there are no more questions, I think we will wrap up. I want to thank Wendy, Michael, Regine, and Aaron for this fantastic discussion, which I know is being recorded and will be up at some point soon, I guess. Thank you all for coming from wherever you were, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Regine. Thank you, Sina. And thank you, Ariola and Karen and everybody. It was really a joy to get to meet you all and to see some of you again.
Thank you, everyone, also from our end here at the Vera List Center, for Aaron, of course, for writing the book, for our speakers, Wendy, Michael, and Regine. You added such a rich and generative understanding of the questions the book raises by bringing in references from Alfred Jarry to your own artistic practice and the experience of war and destruction that the Iraqi people have lived throughout the American invasions and insurgencies. And as Michael put it, thank you also for merging your shared histories and relations to this history and legacy. And thank you, Sina, of course, and Cabinet Magazine for organizing and bringing together new and old friends for us here at the Vera List Center. Michael last participated in our Freedom of Speech seminar series, and the forthcoming publication out of that series called Studies into Darkness, Artists and Activists Consider the Perils and Promise of Freedom of Speech, which I think very much relates to the conversation that we had together. With that, I want to invite you also to join us for our current S for Protocol seminar. The third session will be held on November 16th, titled Bring Forth the Body, Biopower, Protocol, and Plagues. And it is being led by faculty here at the New School, Joshua Scannell, with Anthony Ryan Hatch, Rona Kapadia, Jasbir Puar, and artists Stephanie Misa and James Klar. With that, again, thank you so much for joining us and for spending this Sunday afternoon with us. Please take care and be well, especially in the week ahead of us.